Welcome everybody. Now, today is the 3rd of August, but despite that, don't be fooled. This is our July Culture Club. We're running a little bit late. So this is our July meeting. And tonight we are really very thrilled to have two of our Temple Israel stalwarts on the program. We're focusing tonight on a book that has been written by one of our very own, by Hedi Lampert. And I must say, the first time I met Hedi, I was very impressed by the way her guitar playing and her singing. And then I saw on Facebook that she does a lot of beautiful art and crafts. And then I saw something else I can't remember. And now we see she's written a book. So she's a very multi-talented polymath of a person, and I see on her signature, she runs a copywriting, editing, voiceover, and photography business. So just to add to her string of talents and skills. So Hedi, we're very happy to have you tonight with us to talk about your recently published book, The Trouble with My Aunt, and we're very excited to hear about that. And I'm also happy tonight because my task is made very easy because Hedi is going to be in conversation with our very own Beryl Eichenberger. And Beryl describes herself as a senior teenager, someone after my own heart. And she has had a very long career, and she now is best known for her work on the Jewish Literary Festival. She works on Fine Music Radio, and her main claim to fame is that she does voiceovers for soap operas, Telemundo meets Bollywood. So, Beryl, we're looking forward to this conversation you're going to have with Hedi tonight, and I can sit and watch and enjoy. So welcome everybody. We're glad to have you all here, and I'll handing over into your capable hands, Beryl.
Thank you, Glenda. Thank you. And thank you, Eric. And thank you very much for inviting us this evening. And hello to everybody else. I promise I won't put on my Hindi accent for the Bollywood stuff tonight, for the voiceovers. Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to actually welcome Hedi Lampert, whom a lot of you know. In fact, most of you probably know from her musical evenings at the Shores, but she is a multi-talented woman, and I'm very proud to be able to work with her on promoting The Trouble with My Aunt. So The Trouble with My Aunt is her first novel. She has written another book, but it was a non-fiction book and a memoir for Mike Creer, if I'm correct in remembering that. But this is her first novel, and it's set in the last 30 years of the 20th century in a very typical Jewish family in Johannesburg. And I promise you that you will recognize the characters because we'll be talking about them. The protagonist is Leah. She has an unplanned pregnancy, and there's a whole story behind that, which is also quite complicated and fun. And that unleashes a complex journey of uncovering secrets, diagnoses, and negotiating family dynamics, because within the family is an intellectually challenged aunt. But we're going to talk to Hedi more to talk about this frank, honest, and very empathetic story that I promise you will have you laughing out loud and wiping away a tear on many occasions. You know, a novel has to have all the elements that grab you. A compelling story, romance, relationships, career, and lots of challenges. And of course, in this case, it's having an intellectually impaired family member. I'm going to get Hedi to read some pieces, but let's start with this headline. Nobody really knew what the trouble was with Auntie Vai. All I knew was that it was Gran's fault, says Leah. Now that's one of the headlines that we've been using to promote. And if anything will grab you, that grabs you. Why would it be Gran's fault? But we're going to answer some of those questions within our discussion. I have to tell you that the book is taken from actual experiences. and gives an insight into what it is like living with a family member who, at the beginning of the book, we don't know actually what is wrong with her. And it's only during the course of the story that we find out. So Hedi, welcome. Thank you. I think I've put it all on the table now. You know, Gus Silver said that a book's got to grab you from the very start and that you just get into it immediately. And that's exactly what happens with this book. So I'm going to ask Hedi to read the short prologue, because if the headline hasn't grabbed you, then the prologue definitely is going to. Hedi.
Thank you, Beryl, and thank you, Glenda, for organizing this. Thank you, Eric. Thank you all for having me. I feel very much that this is like being with family, given that Temple Israel is my second home. So here is the prologue. You know, when people pray at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, they write their secret prayers on slips of paper and roll them into tiny scrolls, or fold them up tightly and push them into the cracks between the stones, said my mother. This worried me. How could you trust that the notes wouldn't be plucked out and read by someone else? No one ever does that, she said. I suppose people just know that some things can only be shared with God. It was Friday night, and she lit the Shabbat candles. The match popped and hissed into a flare. I covered my eyes and recited the Hebrew prayer I'd learned at school. As always, my mother remained silent, clearly invoking her right to secrecy, which was probably not such a bad thing, given that she was praying for her sister's death.
That's quite something to start with, but we're not going to lead straight into that. We're going to move into it as to the reasons why she was hoping for her sister's death. But I want to start off with painting a picture of the characters, because they are so colorful and they are so recognizable. You will all know one or two or three of these characters. Let's talk about Leah first as the main character.
So Leah is, she's 32. She's a young career person. And she, like many of her generation, has been educated as a young woman who can probably have it all. And yet, there's other kind of nagging thing, yeah, but you should also be married with a nice husband and having children. And, you know, she straddles those two worlds. And that much is clear in conversations. I mean, at the very start, you know, her gran says to her, you know, she gets this marvelous promotion at work. She works in the events coordination industry, and gran says to her, you know, what do you want to be working with yolks for your whole life? When are you going to get married and settle down? So, you know, having a baby is the furthest thing from her mind when she you know, it's all an accident after a one-night stand, which is what develops. But it's more Leah's relationship with her mother, her granny, and her aunt, as you'll see, that unravels the events.
I think it's very appropriate, actually, that we're doing this in August, Glenda. So never mind that it's the July session. This is Women's Month. And we're kicking off with a book that is very woman-focused. It's very a tight-knit family of women, each with their own lives, each with their own secrets as well. So Leah falls pregnant, and there's a whole story behind that. And Gran and Amy, who is Leah's mother, live together with Auntie Vai. Tell us a little bit about Auntie Vai, because she is the central character in respect of her being intellectually impaired.
Auntie Vai is an interesting character. She's only 18 months younger than Leah's mother, but she's very childlike. And when Leah was 3 or 4, they were best friends. But she soon outgrew her aunt in terms of intellectual capacity. But yet there's this constant wrestling. She has this connection with her aunt, but she's also profoundly irritated by her. And when she falls pregnant with this unplanned child, she is immediately struck by a terrible fear. What if something's wrong with the baby? But nobody really knows what's wrong with Auntie Vi. So she doesn't know what to ask her doctor to test for. And the whole story begins to unfold as she starts to search for things that could possibly be wrong with her own child, not knowing what's really wrong with her own aunt. But it's in conversation that we start to realize what the symptoms of the particular problem are. So, for example, we've got Granny, who's also quite challenging. I too found it difficult to deal with my grandmother's foolishness. It wasn't that she was completely uneducated. She could read and write and do basic arithmetic. It was not something I could pin down or give a name to. One had to be there in the same room as Gran, trying to have a conversation with her. There was the time Gran had asked, "Leah, did Morris and Gertie Kaplan come to your house for supper?" I had barely finished uttering the first word of my reply when Gran had resumed speaking. "Oh, well, I suppose he ate like a pig and rocked back on your mother's dining chair. You know, he broke one of my antique chairs doing that." "Yes, he did, you know," echoed Auntie Vi. "He broke one of your granny's chairs. And she's also got a tochus on her." Gran held her hands apart, indicating the extent of Gertie Kaplan's considerable buttocks. "Yes, she has, you know. She's got a big tochus," added Auntie Vi. Her expression was grave, and then suddenly she had a giggling fit. "Granny, Granny!" I had to raise my voice to be heard. "I'm trying to answer you. They didn't even—" "Don't you shout at me, young lady." "But you don't let me talk. I'm trying to tell you." I was yelling at this point. My cheeks were burning. "Oh, there's that temper, just like her father." "But, Granny, they didn't even come for supper." "Why didn't you say so?" asked Gran, and she was genuinely surprised. "You didn't give me a chance." "Oh, so cheeky." "I can't talk to you." I marched out of the room. "Just like her father," said Gran. So, yeah, there was a lot of...
Recognizable? I think we all know characters like that. In fact, I can pick out the ones in my own family who are exactly like that. But Hedi, the characters are based on truth because the experiences are based on your own real life experiences. When you were constructing the characters, and I mean, there's Gran, Sadie, her name is. There's Auntie Vi. There's Amy, Leah's mother, who's the softest, sweetest, most beautiful woman. And there's some wonderful other characters. And I'm thinking of the women characters like Lily Gerber, who has to be my favorite character because she reminds me of an aunt because she's so eccentric. It's delicious. But when you were constructing them, what did you draw on the real people that the story sort of it envelops, or did you take bits of other people and sort of put them together so they weren't quite so recognizable?
No, yes and no. So the characters of the granny, the mother, and the aunt are very true to my own mother, grandmother, and aunt. But the characters of the men are constructed, and the character of Steve is pretty much fictional. And the character of Leah is, people say, "Oh, are you Leah?" Well, I mean, I write it in first person, and there's a part of me that's there, but by no means have I exposed myself or put all of me in, not at all. Maybe the neurotic side of me, the one who reads the contraindications on the bottles of medicine, that's in as Leah. But I just had so much material at my fingertips in my own family that I really didn't have to look very far. So I was fortunate in that regard.
And what pushed you into finally writing the story? Because Well, as we said, it's set in the last 30 years of the 20th century. During that time, your real aunt's problem was diagnosed, but it was only sort of in the late 80s or so that they actually knew what her syndrome was. So you've grown up with this, you've known what this syndrome is, but in the last 15 years, you've been researching this particular syndrome. And that's a long time to be researching something. But what finally pushed you into saying, you know what, I have to write this story, but I have to write it as a novel, as fiction?
So it was a process, really. But I think that I'd always been a magazine journalist, and I'd written a lot of health and medical stuff, which is a great love of mine. But I had taken about 10 years off writing professionally to bring up my babies, and I started feeling a great need to write again. So I joined a writing group with the late Anne Schuster, and one of her courses was delving down into the self and finding, finding the gold there. And so it was in these free writing exercises where I was writing about family that I suddenly thought, wow, I've got a book here. But that was back in probably 2005, and like many people, when you start writing memoir type stuff, you think, oh well, this is a huge book, but you get to a point where you've only got, say, 10 or 20,000 words, maybe 30,000 words, which is nowhere near enough for a novel. And so I started doing other creative writing courses, and I started to learn the importance of plot. And I realized that I had to start creating stuff. And at the beginning, that was really hard, because I felt I was lying, because I was talking about truth, and yet I was having to create other stuff. And there was a big disconnect for me. And I had to really learn to trust myself and write fiction with an authentic voice. And that was the process. That's what probably took so long, because I wrote thousands of drafts of this book and changed it from first person to second person to third person to past tense, present tense, and eventually came to this particular format. And yes, you're right. It was in the 80s that we found out that my aunt had Fragile X syndrome. So to talk a bit about that, Fragile X syndrome is a genetic disorder. So it's inherited, and it's virtually as common as Down syndrome, but Down syndrome is not inherited. Fragile X runs in families, and the reason, the way we discovered it was that my cousin, who has a profoundly affected son with Fragile X, had been researching, and her husband had finally found someone at Johns Hopkins University who had identified the symptoms as this particular syndrome. And it had only come to light really sort of mid-80s, virtually beginning of 90s, that there was in fact a diagnostic tool available, an actual test that could identify this chromosomal abnormality. And so I knew about it long before I started having kids, because I was tested, and fortunately I was negative. I wasn't a carrier, my mother wasn't a carrier, but my gran was a carrier, and my aunt is a sufferer.
So let's talk a little bit about Fragile X and how it manifests itself.
Yes.
Leah's pregnant. She doesn't want her child, or she's scared that her child may have the same syndrome, which she doesn't know what it is at that particular stage. So perhaps take us from when Leah finds that she's pregnant, and talk to us a little bit about this, the manifestations of Fragile X, and then how Leah finds out what the process was, because that you put it so very well in the book. It sounds terribly medical and could be quite dry if it's a medical condition, but Hedi handles it so well because the book is dialogue driven. So there's these conversations talking about it, but there are some wonderful stories as well about Auntie Vai, and we'll get to that in Stutford's in Johannesburg. But let's talk a little bit about that leading up to finding out that it's Fragile X and what the manifestations of Fragile X, because we do know that autism is one of the major concerns,
Yes.
or one of the major things that can happen.
So I'm going to read you a little excerpt about Vai, Auntie Vai as a child. We knew that, you know, she walked late, she talked late, she had this strange sort of wiry hair as a child, and it was always seen as an underactive thyroid. So her whole life she was taken to an endocrinologist, and that's all we knew, that she had thyroid issues, and she saw a gland doctor, as they were called in those days. So we sat in silence for a while. I gazed at the photograph of Vi and my mother as toddlers. It stood on a dresser in the living room. It had been taken in a studio. Both little faces were framed with neatly brushed, fringed bobs. "Look how exquisite you were, Mom," I said. "Vi's very cute, though, with her round cheeks and blue eyes and that button nose." "Yes, but sadly cuteness wasn't enough, though. Not for the nuns at St. Agatha's Convent Preparatory. They sent Vi home halfway through grade 2. "Shame, poor little thing," I said. "Yes, well, she just sat in the classroom eating her sandwiches and chewing the pencils," said my mother. A string of tutors came to our house, but Vi still couldn't read a word or write a sum, or do a sum, and she would have terrible tantrums. She would roll up her tongue and bite it so it turned blue. It was horrible. My mother closed her eyes and shuddered. Then, when she wouldn't practice her reading, Gran used to hit her over the head with a rolled-up newspaper. It drove me crazy. I would scream at her to stop, and she'd storm out of the room and go for a lie down. Horrified, I stared at my mother. When the scene played itself out in my head, the actors were miniature and located at the far end of a room with high ceilings. I could focus on the faces of little Vi and her big sister Amy, although they were in black and white, like the old photographs under the dressing table glass. But in her role as young mother, Gran was featureless, and I could only visualize her back. "You know, Vi used to break all my toys," continued my mother. I nodded. I'd heard the tale because it was one of those stories my mother had repeated over the years. Vi tried to undress the dolls, but she wasn't good with buttons or zips, so she would tear and bite their clothes. Sometimes a doll would lose a limb or even a head in the ordeal. This was how little Vi accumulated a personal toy stash, a motley company of the fallen and the maimed. Young Amy couldn't bear to touch them after her sister had had her spitty way with them. But if anyone said a word against Vi, I reared up like a mother cat. My mother held up both hands and curled her fingers into claws, opening her green eyes wide. There was a girl who called her a dumb donkey. I punched her in the face and told her she could never ever come to our house again. My mother sighed. She looked away and said, "I can't remember a time I haven't felt responsible for my sister." In her teens, I'm going to read this. So, did she just stay at home with Gran? I asked. Well, yes. She couldn't seem to progress beyond the mental age of 3 or 4, and even then, she walked late, started talking late. All her milestones were delayed, and in those days there were no special schools or any kind of support really. My mother continued, and she was clumsy because of her thick fingers and her flat feet. In her teens, any semblance of Vi's former cuteness gave way to an unappealing combination of bodily and facial features. Unlike her curvy, long-limbed sister, Vi was more potato than person, in that she was wider at the waist than the hip. Her face had become elongated and the eyes heavy-lidded and droopy. One was lazy, so Vi appeared cross-eyed. Her smile was lopsided. A bulbous nose with widened nostrils lent a strong bovine resemblance, which, according to my mother, was not lost on other children. and like predators smelling blood on the wind, they leapt on an irresistible and cruel new moniker. Vi became known as the Bull, and her older sister dealt out punches left, right, and centre. I recalled seeing the film version of Cinderella, the ballet, in which Sir Frederick Ashton plays one of the ugly sisters and wears a large fake nose. I couldn't help thinking that he looked just like Vi. When Gran goes, God forbid, Vi will be my sole responsibility. My mother looked at me. I've never told anyone this before, but there's not a day that goes by that I don't pray that Vi dies before I do, because if I go first, Leah, she'll be your cross to bear.
Which answers your question, or answers from the prologue, why she's wishing for her sister to die. You mentioned there that the facilities, there were no facilities for people like Auntie Vi in those days. And in any event, it wasn't an option in the Fine family. Why was that?
Well, okay, well, in terms of schools, there were obviously no schools. My aunt was born in 1933. So
Yeah.
children like that were cast aside. It was just, they were seen as retarded, and so many were institutionalized. But my grandfather decreed in his will that my aunt should never be institutionalized. And while my grandparents were alive, she lived with them. And then she lived with my mother. And now that my mom's gone, she lives in an old age home in Johannesburg, where she's very happy. And you know, my mother was quite, this is now in real life, when she had cancer and she could not look after my aunt anymore. And I said, we've got to move her, because I was living in Cape Town, and she was beside herself. But Grandpa said she must never be institutionalized. I said, but this is not an institution. This is not Selwyn Seagull or Glendale. This is the, you know, old age home where she loves. She goes there for occupational therapy. And it as much as my mother was burdened by looking after her sister, what terrified her more was not being around to look after her sister. And she literally lived in more fear of not being around. And sadly, the irony is that she's not around to look after my aunt.
And but Auntie Vi also displays a wonderful sense of humor, and there's some very, very funny things that happen in the book. Again, things that I think a Jewish family will recognize very, very much so. But I love the fact that Auntie Vi was very, very proud of her hair.
Yes.
And every week she had to go to the hairdresser. Tell us a little bit about that, because that's really important to Auntie Vi. So appearance was everything.
Yes. Her life was pretty much measured in terms of, was she having a perm? Had she had a perm? Was she about to have a perm? And anybody who presented themselves for a chat would be asked about their perm status. And a new person presented a dizzying opportunity for my aunt, because you know, they wouldn't be rude to her and sort of cast her aside. So, for example, now, now this is when the medical researcher comes to take blood for everybody, because we now know that there might be a possibility of the Fragile X. So, I'll read you this. So, the medical researcher arrived on time. She wore a tunic of teal blue bearing a badge with her name on the lapel. I noticed her huge calves and the serviceable flat lace-up brogues. Sister Natalie Weinstein, she announced. Natalie was broad-shouldered, busty and wide-hipped. She wore her hair in 2 incongruous pigtails. She had an open, friendly face. I imagined she'd be perfect, cast as the farmer's wife or perhaps the milkmaid in a Christmas pantomime. Okay, so we're going to take bloods, and I'm going to send them to Professor von Stemmet in Belgium. Her delivery was light and lilting, as if she was addressing a group of preschoolers. My mother was her usual garrulous self. My first job was at medical research. There was an eye suspended in liquid in a jar. It followed me everywhere I went in the lab. It gave me the creeps. Oh, that's hysterical, said Natalie. I bristled. I didn't want this person in my living room. jovial as she was, and I couldn't help feeling a little annoyed with my mother for making so merry. Gran and Vi sat without speaking. Getting them there had been easier than I'd imagined. I'd given Gran a vague explanation along the lines of checking the baby's blood type against that of other family members. I added that it was for a project this Natalie girl was doing. Gran had accepted my explanation without asking any questions. That it was unthinkable to actually say anything to my grandmother, which might insinuate that Vi was mentally inadequate, was something I understood implicitly. I also knew, without fear of contradiction, that my mother concurred. It didn't even bear discussion. As if she had a quota of words to reach, my mother chatted on incessantly. "Are you related to the shoe Weinsteins or the hardware Weinsteins?" she inquired. Then she wondered aloud about another branch of Weinsteins, who had gone into kosher sausages and polony. Natalie claimed kinship with the shoe branch of the greater Weinstein clan. "This nice nurse is going to take our blood, Vi," Gran said. "Yes, all right," said Vi. She made a little sobbing sound when the needle went in. Natalie rubbed her forearm. "Okay, my sweetheart," she said, "it's all over now." "Oh, you're such a darling," said Vi, but her voice broke and she let out a wail. "Stop it, Vi," said Gran sharply. "That's enough." Vi stopped crying immediately and blew her nose with the crumpled tissue she pulled out from under her sleeve. "Do you perm your hair?" she asked Natalie. "No, I don't," she replied. "My hair is dead straight. I just tie it up." "I'm having a perm next Tuesday, you know," offered Vi. "That's nice," said Natalie. She was labelling the vials of blood. So, yeah, there was always the perm thing, and it didn't matter who she was talking to. It always came up.
Yes, there's several parts in the book where they're in a sort of social set. She was you create her as a very social person.
Very, very
she could
social,
interact,
very
so
friendly.
she was very high functioning.
Yes, which is the
Very
thing
high
about
functioning
Fragile
in
X.
terms of which.
The often women
Sorry, I missed that.
women who suffer from Fragile X are generally more high functioning than their male counterparts, which is because women have two X chromosomes. So it will only be one of the chromosomes that is affected, and the other X chromosome will be the backup. But men who suffer from Fragile X only have one X chromosome. The other chromosome is a Y chromosome. So an affected X on a man is going to really compromise his performance in terms of his academics, his cognitive development, his emotional development, and everything else.
And you portray that very well with your cousin Julie's, or Leah's cousin Julie's son Nathan, which is where the search starts and finishes, really, because they discover what's wrong with him and takes Leah on this journey.
Yes.
And
well, yes, carry on.
No, what I wanted to ask you was, we started off with this because Gran considers that Auntie Vai's condition is her fault.
Yes.
Why?
Okay.
Why does she? And I know that you can't tell Gran exactly what is wrong with Auntie Vai when you find out. But why is it that Gran thinks that Auntie Vai's condition is her fault?
Okay, so this is a bit of a spoiler, but there's so much other drama in the book that
yes, there's lots of drama.
There's so much drama. I think there's enough to keep you all going. So I'm going to actually, I'd rather read you that section, and if you just bear with me in that little scene, I would like very much to find it. So what I will say while I'm looking for it is that Leah has been going for all sorts of tests, amnio and this and that, and then her mother finally tells her that there's always been this family myth, this family story about, oh well, Gran fell pregnant with me when Gran fell pregnant with Vi when I was only 9 months old. And Granny's milk was blue, which meant it was lacking in nutrition. So the mother in the book is starving to death as a baby. So she's losing weight. There's a pregnancy going on. She's still trying to breastfeed this 9-month-old, and so in a state of absolute panic, she tries to get rid of the baby. But in those days, well, you know, how do you actually do that? And it's about here. Oh God, where is it? Damn it. She gets oh damn, it's such a drama.
Should
Anyway,
we talk
we'll
maybe
find
then
it. Ask
a
me
little bit
something else
about,
and I'll find it.
yeah, I'm going to. Family dynamics. The effect of a family having a cognitively impaired member. And I think that you described this extremely well. There is a lot of drama in the book, but there's so much humor, and so there's some wonderfully funny situations. And the story of Leah and this peculiar love affair that she has with the father of the child. I think Leah's upbringing had also sort of impacted on her ability to have a relationship as well. And sorry, that's probably coming from the left side or whatever. But the family dynamics of having a cognitively impaired member, how was that affected?
Well, there was this huge protection of Gran. So while Gran tried to terminate this pregnancy by taking a thing called she took some Ergotrate, which there's a whole drama about how she gets that. So Ergotrate is apparently derived from a fungus that grows on rye, and it was discovered that it caused, if pregnant cows grazed on this particular fungal rye, they abort their calves. So Ergotrate is used to bring on labor, and also used to get rid of the placenta afterwards, to bring on additional contractions.
Mm-hmm.
So it was widely used by midwives. So she tries to terminate, but nothing happens. The pregnancy goes through. So when this child is born looking a little bit strange and all the milestones are delayed, she obviously blames herself. And she sets about then trying to make reparations and look after this child and teach. Even in her late 80s, and this is true and it's in the book, my gran was still trying to teach my aunt to read. And there's a scene in the book where Leah walks past the room and overhears her aunt reading from the Enid Blyton books, The Secret Seven, and she's, wow, they're all my Enid Blyton books, because they were still trying to teach her to read. But it was all very private. But you could not, when they found out that in fact it wasn't Gran's fault, there was a genetic thing, you couldn't tell Gran that, because that would have been worse for her. That, for me, was the biggest irony of the whole thing, and that is why I knew I had to write this novel. And there's also there's a strange kind of prejudice within the family, where even the mother comments on a child, a particularly cognitively impaired child at Leah's nursery school. So her own mother, who's got this sister who's cognitively impaired, makes a comment about a child at preschool and says, this child who is sucking his paintbrush and his lips are green, leaf green. She says, shame, there's the little spastic. In the terrible word that we used in those days, quite freely we bandied it about. And you know, but her own sister. So there was this, oh, you know, he's a Meshuggah. Vi's got a wonderful memory. You know, there's nothing wrong with her.
The memory was brilliant.
Yes, so there's this scene.
And Gran harps on that memory.
Oh,
She
yes.
in the various social situations, she actually brings up the fact that Vi has this extraordinary memory. When Gran herself can't remember something, she asks
Yes,
Vi, and Vi has it literally on the tip of her tongue, which was
absolutely.
quite extraordinary and sometimes very funny.
So I've got it right here. Having completed her shopping, Gran announced it was time for lunch, and we took the lift to the top floor of John Orr's. The lift attendant slid open the gate, and we stepped out into the tea room. Voices hummed and cutlery clinked. I inhaled the aroma of toasting bread and frying chips. Oh, please may I have the fish and chips? Gran agreed. A waiter appeared and handed menus to Gran and Auntie Vi. Gran perused her menu and announced that she would have a toasted cheese and tomato, and added, Vi, you can also have a toasted cheese. Yes, I'll have a toasted cheese. She placed a stress on the word cheese. She had not looked at the menu. She never did. Gran always told her what to have. Oh, look, there's what's-her-name's sister-in-law. Oh, what's her name, for heaven's sake? Gran raised her hand, wiggling her fingers in Auntie Vi's direction. Dorothy Klavansky. Auntie Vi responded instantly. Vi's got a wonderful memory, said Gran. Finish your hake, Leah. Is it not nice? I suppose it's not as good as mine. I'll get some fresh sole from OK Bazaars and we'll have that. No one fries fish like your granny. Your granny, echoed Auntie Vi. But I like this hake. I mopped up the remains of tomato sauce with a slice of buttered white bread. Good girl, she's got an appetite, Canaan Horror, bless her, said Gran, to no one in particular. Yes, she's got an appetite, Canaan Horror, said Auntie Vi. Yeah.
And repetitiveness was another thing. But
yes, that's called perseveration, and it is one of the symptoms of the syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're up to 9:15, and I think I'm hoping that there are some questions, and I'm not sure whether the guests, Glenda, maybe you can help me here, whether the guests should write their questions in the chat section or the Q&A, and then we can pose them to Hedi, or we'll carry on in the meantime. What would you like guests to do if they have questions?
Well, what we've done before is if the person would just unmute or raise their hand and ask their question, but they can use the chat.
That's fine.
But I think it will be nice to have some time for questions now.
I'd like to show everybody I'd like to show some pictures, if I may, which are a combination of photographs, actual photographs of my aunt and my gran, and then some drawings from the cover of the book. So this is, on the left is Granny, and that is, okay, so there's the book. All right, so now on the left is my mother, and that is her sister. Now you can see that already this beautiful little ghostly looking one, thin one, is already grave with responsibility. And there's little Vi, not a care in the world, quite giggly. Probably you can see something's tickled her fancy there. And there again, that's on the left is Vi, very cute, and on the right is my mother like a little doll. That is the only picture that I can find of my granny and my mother. Every other picture from then, and it was actually heartbreaking because in the book I do write that one time my mother let down her guard, and she said, when Vi came along, my mother became her mother and not mine anymore. And every other picture in the entire history of my family is of my grandmother and my aunt, not my mom. There you have
it. Which I think goes to the family dynamics.
Yes, yes. So on the far right is my aunt, and next to her is my mother, looking rather beautiful. And again, you can see which one my mom is on the right and my aunt on the left. That's my gran on the left and my aunt on the right. And there, as my gran got much older, at that point, my gran was in her 90s. And there's my aunt probably in her, what would have been in her 70s there. She recently turned 87. So that's just, this is one of the sketches that I did, the sketches for the cover. So that would be the aunt, or the two little girls. That would be little Leah. And then that is Ken Greenberg, who you will meet in the book. He is a very, very interesting character who plays quite a mysterious role. But I'm not going to tell you anything about that. You'll have to discover it. That's just...
No spoilers.
No spoilers. Auntie Vai having a perm. This is the love interest. This is the father of Leah's unborn child. Well, the child is born eventually. And this is pregnant Leah, looking quite distressed and worried about everything. She's just a constant worrier. So let's have questions if there are any.
Take some questions. I think if I can just wrap very, very quickly so that you can answer questions. I think what Hedi's done here is she's taken a very sensitive and complex subject, but she's built a wonderfully honest story around it. It is a great story. Once you get your head into it, and with that prologue, there's no reason why you can't. You will. You won't stop reading it. It's an absolute page turner, but it opens the door on a subject that a lot of people would not talk about and how it affects a family, but it's always done with the most wonderful humor. So that's Hedi. Thank you very much. Can we open the floor for questions, if there are any? Or is everybody going to be quiet tonight?
Dawn?
John.
Well, Hedi, I mean, I've got a very, very close friend who have a child who's autistic, who's now 27 or 28. And it was just so, because I can see so much of what you're explaining in your experiences. But what I find so remarkable in their situation and in yours is that the family stayed together, because I think the risk so often is that the family breaks up and that there's so much stress that goes along with a child that doesn't grow up, isn't independent. It's not that easy. You know, when we have a meal together, there's always an extra. And it's just, you have to just cope with the fact that the child, the young adult is different. And it's a beautiful, I can so relate to it, because this family are so much like yours, just so beautifully amazing to cope with a child that is challenged. I'm not sure I'd have the courage to do that. So it's remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if I would either. I mean, and a lot of when Beryl speaks about honesty, I have been brutally honest in the book about the levels of irritation and guilt that I experienced and Leah experiences. So that is all very much true. And even looking after my aunt in the last few years, as she's been my sole responsibility virtually, a lot of stuff comes up, you know, how I financially, emotionally.
Exactly.
And she
because
does.
I'm aware that the kids, because there's a daughter involved, I know that the parents are very aware that the daughter at some stage will be the sole survivor. And then, you know, you can do the best that you can. So it sounds like a really beautiful story that you've managed to end, and hopefully it can help other people going through, like motivate them to go through, to kind of get it together, because it's not easy to live with it every day.
It's not, and you've got to sort of also look for the lovely moments. So there are many of those, and I'm particularly struck at the moment by there's a lot of on autism awareness. So Fragile X is a leading cause of a leading inherited cause of autism. And my aunt certainly has autistic type of autistic symptoms. My cousin's child was profoundly autistic as a younger child, somewhat better now, but still very much autistic. They live in Israel, and they moved to Israel so that he could get such brilliant care. He does. But the point I want to make is there's a new show on Netflix called Love on the Spectrum, and all my aunt has ever wanted is a romance. And there is a strong romantic theme that does include her in the book, which is a very, very interesting and wacky, but I have to tell you now, 100% true part of the book. Even though it looks like the most fictional part of the book, it's 100% true.
We've had a message from Tony. He wants to comment. He's
Hi, Tony.
With pleasure.
Tony, go ahead.
Hi. I have a couple of comments. And the first comment is, it's interesting that when one is saddled with somebody like your aunt, you can go one of two ways. It can build a very strong, resilient family that is very receptive to what is needed around them. And that is something that sometimes comes through, despite what everybody feels the downsides. And I have a number of instances where people, because of what happened and the child like that, changed all the laws in Connecticut where I lived for disabled children, and which was a profound thing. But the other thing I wanted to comment on, and you haven't alluded to, is a fantastic job you do of making the medical condition, the diagnosis, and laying it out so easy for lay people. Being a physician, it was very easy for me to understand it, but I think you put it down so beautifully that I must commend you on that. It really opens up genetics in a way that a lot of people can understand.
Thanks, Tony. And you gave me such a great review on Goodreads, which I'm so grateful for. But I must say that the genetic side of it is something that, apart from fascinating me, I mean, I just do love medicine. And having been a medical writer before, it's just one of the things I love doing. So yeah, that was a challenge that I was kind of looking forward to in the book. But thank you very much for noticing that. Thank you.
I think at this particular stage, we should also tell people where they can buy the book, because we want lots of sales.
Yes.
So you can buy it on Amazon, good bookstores. It's in the Book Lounge and Exclusive Books. And you can also buy it directly from Hedi. Do you want to give those details, Hedi, if people do want to contact you directly?
I have given Eric the details, and we can put them up, but we can also email you. But yes, I'm happy if for example, you're not going out at all, I'm happy to deliver books to your house, a signed copy, or you can collect from my house, or if you want to go out or get it online, it as I say, it is on Kindle. So yeah, Eric can send you, just pop your name in the chat box, or ask him to email you, and he will send you that info.
Yeah, we have put Fred's telephone number on the chat as well, if you look at the chat now.
Yeah.
Yes, Fred is my cousin in Joburg, so he's got them directly, but the bookstores in Joburg should have them by now.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments?
Any other comments or questions?
It's a lovely question here, which I have to tell you, from Amelie. Is there anything you can't do, Hedi?
Amelie, I
don't think there is. I think you can do everything.
I'm very good at climbing
you
trees. I can't climb trees. And never have been able to. And yeah, and algebra, I suck at algebra. So yeah.
Hedi.
And so say all of us.
Hedi, may I say something?
Yes.
What I've written, in case you don't read it, I've said thank you for a wonderful interview. There's a lovely dialogue between Beryl and the most talented Hedi. A pleasure to listen to you. Such a vivid, interesting talk. I must read this book. And then when I saw you did the illustrations as well, I added, You are so talented. And I know you play the guitar beautifully.
Thank you. Thank you.
You are really, it's a pleasure to deal with. And look at your kitty behind you's been giving us a lot of entertainment.
Oh, this kitchen.
She's drawing your curtain at the
Yes,
moment.
that's Lizzie. Thank you.
You really write beautifully. You read beautifully. You know, you could write it, but you wouldn't, that some people can't put it across when they read their own work. But you read so beautifully. It is so alive. It's so vital. It's so, you see the comedy, you see the situation, and the drama, the comedy. And it's a book I really want to read. I don't know how to use Amazon. So I see there's a number here for Fred David, but you say he's in
That's
jail.
Joburg, but Hilda, I can deliver one to you personally in Cape Town. Just get my number from Eric.
Hilda,
From Eric.
just send me an email, Hilda, and I'll send you the details, okay?
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
I look forward to reading that book. I really do.
Thank you for being with us.
Kol hakavod. I'm supposed to be
Everybody. Thank you, Hilda. Hilda's done my task for me. She's to thank Hedi and to thank Beryl for this lovely interchange between you and for sharing with us and taking us into your creative process and giving us that insight. The way I'm very interested in how you said your real life, you had so much material, but yet you had to fictionalize it and turn it into a novel. That's a very interesting thought, and we can continue to discuss that. But thank you for being with us tonight and for sharing. And whoever's interested in the book, we have got the details on the chat. I just want to end off with two announcements. Last month, we showed the documentary Hutchinson Shunted, and we just saw snippets of the documentary. And I just heard today from Eric and Laureen that to please alert everyone that the documentary is showing at the Encounters Festival. And if you want to sign up, you can please go online to www.encounters.coza. So that's quite easy to remember. I'll put it in the chat as well. I'm not sure exactly when it's showing, but I presume you can quite easily, there might be multiple showings once you're on the Encounters site. And then our next session will be at the end of August, the 31st of August, and we will have Mark Gavissa talking about his new book, The Pink Line, which has also been very well received globally. So that's going to be another exciting evening. So please diarise and be ready to join us for that. And thanks to Eric for the background, and thank you everyone for coming and being with us again.
Thank you all very much. And if I could just ask one thing, if you could just share with one or two other people about the book, that would really help me, because I've, the more I can get out there. It came out just before lockdown and all my launches and events were cancelled. So that was a bit of a bummer. So yeah, please share. Thank you for all coming.
Thank